Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you my July wrap-up. So the month of July was a really good reading month for me. I read 17, I'll say works. Not necessarily books, but works, and I'll get to that eventually. And some of those were for the Hugos, so I will talk about the Hugos later on, kind of toward the end of this video, because I read like an entire category for the Hugos this month. But yeah, it was a really interesting month for reading for me. Almost all of these are sci-fi or fantasy. We have a couple of dystopian kind of near future novels. We have some manga. We did the Off the Grid Readathon in the month of July, which was really good. I very much succeeded in that, and you can check out my vlog up above. Yeah, I do have some new releases. In here I have some upcoming stuff that's not been published yet, and I actually even have a nonfiction book in this stack. So let's go ahead and get started. And before we do, I'm just going to apologize, the window's open because it's really hot. Don't ask why I'm wearing a cardigan when it's really hot. I don't have a good answer for you, but it might be a little bit loud outside. Fingers crossed it's not too bad. So the very first book that I finished in the month of July is my nonfiction book, and it was a holdover from the month of June. I almost finished this in June, didn't quite get there, and I finished it up in July. So this is The Good Immigrant, and this is a collection of essays edited by Nikesh Shukla. So this was a really, really interesting and enlightening read after the events of June and the death of George Floyd and the ongoing police brutality in the States and this kind of systematic racism across the world. I decided that I wanted to read some stuff that would maybe be a little bit uncomfortable for me as a white American woman. And I have a ton of stuff on my TBR that I have picked up, but one of the things that I was really interested in was Britain and the history of race and kind of the experience of racism and whatnot in the UK, because very silly, you always see people saying that there's no racism in the UK, which is like the dumbest thing ever. So I went ahead and picked this up because I'd heard so many good things about it, and it's fantastic. If you're looking for a British perspective on race and sort of the immigrant experience, this is a really, really fantastic one. I think there's 18 maybe essays in this book, and they're quite short, maybe like 10 pages on average, and it's a really, really fantastic read. I would very, very highly recommend this one, especially if you're looking kind of for that British perspective or the kind of non-American perspective. The next book I read, I actually have filmed a full review. It's not up yet. It's coming. It's scheduled in, so you can keep an eye out for that. This is Phoenix Extravagant by Yoon-Ha Lee. This was fantastic. I absolutely loved this book so much, and it's easily a favorite of this year. So basically we follow a artist named Jebi who is living in this country that has been colonized. Basically it's fantasy Korea, and the people who have come in to colonize and conquer this nation, it's fantasy Japan. I wasn't sure about that when I did my review, but I have seen the author talk about this since, so that is correct. So basically Jebi is an artist, and they want to continue being an artist. They don't really have any kind of, you know, revolutionary ideas like their sister does, and they just want to work. So they end up taking an exam to become one of the government's artists on their payroll, and they don't end up getting this job, but instead they get recruited by the by basically the military branch to paint these sigils on the masks of these automata that bring them to life. And these automaton sort of act like a police force, sort of helping the occupiers keep control of this city. So of course they end up discovering all these secrets and lies, and they decide that they are going to attempt to help their people in their own wonderful way. So again, I'm going to talk about this more in an upcoming review, but I loved it. You can tell that the author had so much fun writing this book. The dialogue is really fun and really snappy. I found it much easier to get into than his previous series, which starts with Nine Fox Gambit, which is an amazing book. I had absolutely no idea what was going on. So I'm actually going to be rereading that series at some point. But if you had trouble with that, I don't think you need to worry about this. And the characters these are absolutely amazing. I really, really highly recommend this one. I can see if people are looking for something that has really, really rich and deep and intricate world building, this might not be one for you because it is a lighter touch, but it's so much fun. I gave this 4.5 out of 5 stars. It comes out in October now. I think it's been pushed back. This is the Goldsboro SFF edition, so I managed to get my hands on it early. It's one of the books that was pushed back because of the pandemic. The next book that I read is an upcoming release. This comes out in October from Tor Books. It's a novella by one of my favorite authors who I discovered earlier this year and have been absolutely devouring everything he's ever written. This is Ringshot by P. D'Ely Clark. So Ringshot is a novella set in, I believe it's the 1920s-ish American South in a slightly fantastical version. So we have this group of bootleggers and monster hunters. Our main character is Maryse, I believe, and essentially they hunt these monsters called Ku Kluxes. I'm sure you can imagine how that comes into play in the story. So basically they are these kind of monsters that sow chaos and feed off of rage and anger, and they hunt these monsters. She has a sort of kind of like a magical sword that helps her defeat them, and they discover this very sinister plan all centered around, I believe it's the re-release of The Birth of a Nation, which is a horribly, horribly racist film that came out in 1915. So this is a really, really fantastic novella. I think if you are looking for fantasy that is centered around Black characters and Black culture and also by Black authors, this is one you should definitely pick up. The main characters in this are absolutely fantastic. So we have Maryse, who's the kind of the first person perspective telling the story, and she also has these companions alongside of her who fight alongside of her, and they have really fascinating backstories. The kind of the people who are part of this larger group are really fantastic. He has this wonderful way of creating such wonderfully layered world building and characters in such a, short word count, which is something that I'm always impressed by with novella authors. I don't want to say a huge amount about this one because I think this is one of those ones that you should really discover on your own. However, I think that if you are interested in this particular time period, if you want fantasy set in this particular time period, this is definitely one you should pick up. There's obvious content warnings here for racism and mentions of hate crimes and racially motivated killings. There's also some kind of gore and murder in here as well. I gave Ringshot 4.5 out of 5 stars. I thought it was just absolutely fantastic, and clearly I am on a roll this month because everything that I've read so far is really good, and that is definitely going to keep up. Next up, I read another book that has a full review that is forthcoming. It'll be up soon. You'll be able to check out more of my thoughts there. This is Unconquerable Sun by Kate Elliott. This is a book that I've really been looking forward to for ages because it was marketed accurately as gender-swapped Alexander the Great in space, which is amazing. So basically we have this character named Princess Sun, and she is the heir to the throne. Her mother, who is the Queen Marshal, kind of seems very iffy on whether or not Sun should inherit, but Sun is this incredible, she's got this incredible military mind, and while she is very kind of paranoid and mistrustful, often her instincts are correct. So she and other characters sort of uncover a conspiracy, shall we say, to take down this empire. And I really enjoyed this book. It wasn't necessarily the strongest book that I read this month. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars, which is great. But it was definitely the most fun I've had as a reading experience this month, and probably in a really long time. It was just unputdownable, and I will point this out in my review. I literally couldn't put it down to eat. I don't know if you can see. I got pasta stains all over the side of the book. It was just so much fun, and I was completely and totally absorbed in this. So it has amazing world building, it has really great characters. Ironically, I think Princess Sun is probably the weakest of the many, many, many point of view characters. A character named Persephone Lee, who's sort of the heir to this sort of second strongest household in the Empire. Very reluctantly, she absolutely hates her family, was my favorite character. I really enjoyed her. There's so many interesting perspectives in this. I think that having those multiple points of view was one of the best things she did for this book. It's an absolutely sprawling tale. I cannot wait to read more from this. I think it's going to be a trilogy. I know it's the first in a series, and it's just so much fun. I really, really love this one. So if you are interested in space opera and you want something that sort of almost reads with the same levels of fun as like a blockbuster sci-fi film, this is definitely one that you should pick up. So I've clearly been doing a lot of review filming. This review is actually up right now, so you can go ahead and check it out on my channel. I will link it above. This is The Space Between Worlds by Micaiah Johnson. This comes out on the 8th, I believe, of August from Hodder and Stoughton, and this was a really fantastic book. It's kind of billed as a sci-fi thriller, and while it has a lot of those elements, I think it goes into deeper stuff than you would expect from a sci-fi thriller. This book is all about identity and family and how you can possibly fight against what feels like impossible fates. So basically we have this character named Kara, and she is living on Earth, our Earth, in a time when we have discovered parallel universes. And people can travel to parallel universes with the right technology, only if the version of you that is in that parallel universe is dead. So Kara, because she was unfortunately born into a very, very high-risk life of poverty and sort of oppression, she is dead in all but 8 worlds, making her a very, very valuable person to this corporation that employs these world hoppers. So I don't really want to say too much more about the plot because it all kind of unfolds, but to me this had some Mad Max vibes, it had some Blade Runner vibes, and it's a really, really fun read, but it's also such a wonderfully deep and insightful sci-fi read as well. So not going to say too much more about this one. I have a full review that you can go ahead and check out. I gave this one 4 out of 5 stars. Then my audiobook read for the month was The Quiet at the End of the World by Lauren James. This is a UK YA dystopian novel, and I really love Lauren James's The Loneliest Girl in the Universe, which is a fantastic book that you guys should definitely read. And I had very high expectations for this one, and I don't know if they were quite met, but it was still a really good book. So this is a very short and sweet audiobook. It was like 9 hours long. It's available on Scribd, and I'd recommend giving it a listen if you're looking for something that is kind of falls into this category. So in this book, a virus struck the planet and rendered the entire population of the world infertile. So this book takes place about 70 years after that pandemic, and we follow 2 characters named Shen and Lowry, and they are the 2 youngest people on the planet. They are being raised by an elderly and dying population in London. They spend their days mudlarking and, you know, basically living a very normal life as they see it, but obviously, you know, it's not a normal life as far as we're concerned. So they one day uncover secrets that have huge implications for their lives and the lives of the remaining human beings on the planet. I really liked this one. I didn't kind of feel the impact that I had expected, because I feel like with Lauren James books you sort of expect to be like, you know, punched in the face by something coming totally out of left field, and I don't think that I got that one as much. I wasn't as connected with this book as I was The Loneliest Girl in the Universe, but it was a really good and enjoyable read. I liked the main characters. I really, really, really loved, there's a robot named Mitch, which makes a lot of sense in the story. I really liked him as an inclusion. It was a really nice book. It was a really good book, despite the pandemic aspects of this. I do think that it was a really sort of interestingly quiet read, and I liked it, but I didn't love it as much as I expected to. So I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. It's definitely a good read, but I think that if you have sky-high expectations like I did, it might fall a little bit short. Next up, I have some reads from the Off the Grid Readathon. So the first one is the second volume of The Girl from the Other Side by Suil Arun. This is a really, really lovely story. As I say, I think either in my last wrap-up where I read the first volume of this, or in the Off the Grid Readathon vlog that I did, this is sort of like encapsulates everything that I feel like I am as a reader. It's a dark fairy tale. It has monsters in waistcoats who are really lovely and have tea parties with, you know, sad little girls. Like, it's just an absolutely perfect series. My only complaint is that these are so small, and I feel like you get such a tiny sliver of the story for, you know, kind of what you pay for. But that's just, I think, what I have to deal with in order to read these books. So basically, in this particular world, the humans live in these walled cities, greatly fearing the outside, because there are these creatures who kind of haunt the woods outside of these cities, and if they come into physical contact with you, you will turn into one of them. But we have this little girl who's super cute, who is living with one of these monsters. She has somehow found her way outside of one of these cities. She's waiting for her auntie to come and take her back, and he's basically taking care of her. So this is a really, really lovely series. I can't wait to read the rest of them, but it'll probably be a long time just because of the slow accumulation of manga books. They are a little bit pricey for how sort of slim they are. So it might be a birthdays and special occasions kind of thing, but I cannot wait to read the rest of these. They're just so, so lovely. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So next up I have the first volume of The Promised Neverland, and this is by Kayu Shirai. This is a really, really interesting story. I don't want to say too much because this is one that really took me by surprise with how much I enjoyed it. So basically we have an orphanage. We have all these children who are very, very happy living in this orphanage. They have clean clothes, good food, this woman who they call Mom who takes care of them, and one day they discover that not everything is quite right. So I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was really, really interesting, and I cannot wait to read the rest of them. Again, I don't want to say too much about this, but I was very, very surprised by this one, and I think it's going to be an excellent series. So this one I gave 4 out of 5 stars as well. So the last book that I read for the Off the Grid Readathon was a huge hit. This is A Song of Wraiths and Ruin by Roseanne A. Brown. I loved this. I've talked a lot about sort of my issues that I'm having with YA. Last year I was in a huge YA slump and I just couldn't get through almost any YA books. I feel like I'm finally getting back into them now, weirdly thanks to the pandemic, because they're sort of exactly what I need. And this was just like, this was so, so good. This is definitely a favorite of the year, and I strongly urge you to pick it up. It's just fantastic. So this book takes place in a city called Ziron, where there is going to be this sort of epic festival called Solstasia, which marks the passing of this comet overhead. It takes 5 days or so, a week, and it's this huge, huge, huge festival. It decides sort of how the government and the world is going to be guided for the next 50 years based on these different sort of gods and elements. So we have 2 perspectives here. The first is a boy named Malik, who is part of a oppressed community, and he and his sisters are traveling to the city for Solstasia to try to earn some money to buy falsified papers to get their mother and their grandmother out of refugee camps. So they end up entering the city, and his little sister Nadia ends up getting sort of tricked into being held hostage by this sort of horrible magical creature, and the only way that Malik can get her back is to promise to kill the princess. And then we have the perspective of Princess Karina. So she is a very, very reluctant heir to the throne. Her mother is this very capable, fierce ruler, and she's essentially taken the place as heir from her sister who died very tragically. So she never expected to become the heir. She doesn't feel like she has it in her to do what she needs to do, and she kind of isn't taken seriously by anyone around her. So she is going to be sort of overseeing Solstasia, and obviously these 2 perspectives are going to collide. I loved this so much. I feel like the smartest thing about this book is that the author went ahead and took all of my expectations for a YA book. She took these tropes of, you know, the reluctant princess, the you know, the boy who has to do this horrible task, the kind of the YA love interest, all of this, and she flipped them on their heads. Like, Malik is the softest, sweetest cinnamon roll boy ever, and I loved him so much. I absolutely adored him as a character. He's an amazing character, and he has some very, very, very realistic representation of panic attacks and anxiety. And as someone who has panic attacks and anxiety, I really connected with him. A lot of the ways that he deals with his mental health troubles is incredibly realistic, and I really appreciated that. Karina is an amazing, amazing heroine. She is deeply flawed. She doesn't always act the way that she should, but overall you really root for her, and I just adored her character. I talk about this more in that vlog where I'm really fresh having just read it and I'm like, oh, just absolutely gushing about it. But this was such a brilliant book. I loved this so, so, so much, and I cannot wait to read the next one. I think it's going to be a duology. I'm not entirely sure, but I know we have another one coming, and I can't wait to get my hands on it. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. And for the last of the physical books that I read this month, I finished the second volume of Death Note by Tsugumi Oba. So I've talked about this a million times over, you're probably sick of me reciting the exact same thing, but basically this book follows a character who is a sort of model high school student, never been in trouble in his life, kind of incredibly intelligent young man. He finds the Death Note of a Shinigami, a death god. So basically, if a human finds a death note, they have the power to write the name of any person in the death note, and that person will die almost instantaneously. So he decides to take this opportunity to rid the world of crime and criminals, and very quickly falls down a sort of egotistical spiral of awfulness. So this book, or the series, kind of follows him and what he's up to, but also the people who are trying to take him down, not knowing his identity. And that kind of cat and mouse game that gets played up even more in the second book is just really, really excellent. So I don't want to say a huge amount more about this one because it's the second in a series. I have the rest of them. You will see them in my July book haul. I just went ahead and bought the rest because I really enjoyed them. I do have some trouble with the way that some of the women are depicted in this book in particular, which soured things a little bit. We can talk about that sort of off screen if you like, if you're curious. But otherwise I really enjoyed this. I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. So the next book that I read is one that unfortunately didn't click with me, even though I really wanted to love it. So this is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a book that has been a little bit controversial in the book community because of the reviews by white people reading this book, essentially, because it's an Own Voices Native American horror book. So before I start, I want to acknowledge that obviously I want to be honest about how I feel about this book, but there could be other factors such as, internalized issues, and the fact that this book just, even though it wasn't for me, it wasn't written for me. So, what I'm trying to say is basically my opinion on this one doesn't quite matter as much as, say, an Own Voices reviewer, so I'm going to go ahead and link at least one Own Voices review. I need to go ahead and seek them out, so I don't know how many I'm going to post, but I would highly recommend checking those out because those Own Voices reviews are going to be really valuable for this book. So basically, I'm going to talk about this book and the reason why it didn't click with me, but my voice is not that important in this particular discussion. So The Only Good Indians follows a group of, I believe, 4 men 10 years after this particular life-changing event happens, and there is an entity that is kind of stalking them, tormenting them, and seeking revenge upon them. And sorry, that's really vague, but I think that it's definitely a book that is best to know as little about before going into it. So I think where this one didn't necessarily click with me is the writing style. So I think I was expecting something to be a little bit more sort of in line with kind of genre horror, and this is a very literary book. He has a very literary writing style, and often I find with literary writing styles, sometimes they just don't click with me. So that's not really like his fault at all. That's just what my brain likes from a writing style. There were also some choices that he made with the narrative. I don't want to say too much, but if you've read the book, I think you'll probably know what I'm talking about. I much more enjoyed the first half of the book because I felt more connected to that particular story, but he does this thing in the middle where everything kind of changes, and I sometimes struggle when it feels like two books smushed together. Sometimes it doesn't bother me. This is actually something that's come up a lot with books that I've read recently, like Unconquerable Sun or The Space Between Worlds. It didn't bother me as much because it didn't feel as jarring, but this one, that change really ripped me right out of the story, and I had a lot of trouble getting back into it. And this book took me a long time to read because the second half I found I just had so much trouble kind of connecting back into the story in the way that I was connected with the first half. I think something he does really, really well is the horror imagery. It's a book that is lighter on the horror elements than I would have expected, but the horror elements that are there, especially the things that people kind of see out of the corner of their eye, for example, are really, really effective. He does a great job with this sort of creeping dread throughout the book. And again, that's something that I felt much more in the first half than the second half because of a couple of stylistic choices. So if you want to talk about any of this, by the way, just shoot me a DM or something. Don't talk about it in the comments because of spoilers, but I would be more than happy to elaborate, but I don't want to spoil anyone for the story. The social commentary in this book was really, really interesting, and I think it's made me realize that this might be the only Own Voices Native American book that I've ever read, which is quite frankly pretty pathetic, so I'm definitely going to be seeking out those books more often now, especially to see the kind of social commentary aspect of those books, because that is something that I do really enjoy in books that have experiences outside of my own as a straight white woman. So I think that this is definitely one that's worth a read, but I do think it's going to be a bit of a Marmite book. I think some people just won't click with it and some people will absolutely love it. So just a really, really quick content warning for this book. There is some gore, some kind of gore in this one, and murder and all of that good stuff, but there is a lot of animal death. And I'm not talking about the hunting aspects of this book, because there is hunting and dressing of kills in this, but that's not what I mean. I mean the other animal death, and again, if you've read this book, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Just to kind of spoil it a little bit, if you really struggle with dog death, just don't read this. I would really recommend staying away from this. There's some parts of this book that are really, really hard to read in that aspect. So, as I said, this is a book that didn't click with me, but also is not written for me. So I'm gonna go ahead and link those other reviews down below, and I would very, very much recommend you seek out other opinions on this one, because it is such a Marmite book. It is a book by a person of color, and those books need to be supported. But also I think it's one that you should just form your own opinion on. As I always hope comes across with my reviews, just because I don't like a book doesn't mean that I think that you shouldn't read it. Just because I love a book doesn't mean that I think that you should read it. I really, really hope that you will go ahead and seek out more information about this book, because I think it's going to be a really valuable one for some people, but it won't click with others. So the last things that I have on my wrap-up are actually the short story nominations for the Hugos. It feels a little bit like cheating to include these, but they're all Goodreads, so I'm gonna count them individually. So that's what brings me up to 17. There were 5 short stories that were nominated for the Hugos. I managed to read all of them before the awards, and my favorite one actually won the Hugo. So let's run through them really quickly. The nominations for Best Short Story were As the Last I May Know by S.L. Huang. This is a really, really powerful story about war and making these huge decisions to use these weapons of mass destruction against other people and civilians from other countries. So basically we have a sort of near future type world, and in this particular country there is kind of an order that holds essentially the nuclear weapon codes, so that the ruler of the country cannot just hit a button and destroy millions of lives. What they have to do is kill a child who basically lives with them with the codes embedded in, I think, like a chip in their chest. So they have to make the decision to kill one person in order to kill many others. It's so good. It's absolutely worthy of having won the Hugo. It was absolutely incredible. It was such a good short story. I would highly recommend it. If I can find them, I will put the links to all of the short stories down below. I had these from the Hugo voters packet, so I didn't have to like seek out the links, but because these are all in magazines, I believe, I'll link them below where I can. But I would I would really recommend picking up that one. I think of all of them, that was absolutely incredible. So next was Do Not Look Back, My Lion by Alex E. Harrow, who is the author of The 10,000 Doors of January, which was my second favorite book of last year. This takes place in a really interesting world and society that is at war and has these kind of fuzzed gender lines. So we follow the spouse, I believe she's the husband of kind of their society's greatest warrior, and she's an incredibly soft woman. She's a healer. She's deemed as being weak in the society, but she fiercely loves her wife, who is this kind of incredible warrior. And it's all about motherhood and sort of relationships and what you'll do for your family. And it was a really lovely story. So I really liked that one. It wasn't my favorite. It was, I think, it wasn't the only name I recognized from the short story list, but it was one of the few names that I recognized. So I went in having an expectation of really loving this, and I liked it a lot, but it wasn't my favorite. So the next one was actually my second favorite short story. It's absolutely incredible. Another one that I would really highly recommend. This is called And Now His Lordship is Laughing, and this is by Shiv Ramdas. So this takes place in 1943 during the Bengal famine, and it follows a elderly woman who has this wonderful ability to weave these dolls out of this particular fiber, and they basically kind of come to life and they move. The governor of Bengal wants her to make one of these dolls for his wife, and she is refusing, and her people are starving, her family is starving, and she eventually caves. And it's a wonderful story. There's a lot of racism in this one, just as a content warning, but it is one that I think is well worth reading. I thought it was just fantastic, and it was really powerful. This is another one that really stuck with me. Right, what's next? Next is A Catalogue of Storms by Fran Wilde. So this one was probably my least favorite, I think just because I didn't really get it. This is a story that takes place in a world where sort of we've broken the weather, and the weather is sort of fighting back against us. However, there are some people who become what are called weathermen who can kind of push back against the weather. I didn't really get it. This one just didn't really click with me, so that was my least favorite one. I'm sure it's really deep and wonderful, but from what I saw and what I saw from other reviewers, this one just didn't really click with some people. So next is Blood is Another Word for Hunger by Rivers Solomon, who's the other name that I recognized, having read The Deep earlier this year, which is a novella, and I think was also nominated for a Hugo. So Blood is Another Word for Hunger was a really good one. Another one that takes place in the American South. We have a young girl who is a slave, and she basically kills her owners. And this act of brutality sort of births I don't want to say a demon, but kind of a spirit who kind of keeps her company, and she's learning how to regain her personhood again. This one was really good. I really enjoyed this one as well. It is quite brutal. It is quite graphic in some ways, especially when I say birthing a demon or a spirit. I mean that quite literally. So if that makes you a bit squeamish, like it does for me, that might be just something to not avoid, but like just a little heads up that is there. So that was a really good one. I did enjoy that one. And the last short story that I read is 10 excerpts from an annotated bibliography on the cannibal women of Ratnabar Island, which is my favorite title. And this is by Nivedita Sen. So this is really interesting because of the format. I really love the format of this one. It is a bibliography. It's someone citing their sources and their little excerpts from each of those sources about this island of women and children that basically practice cannibalism. And this is a really powerful one. It's the shortest of them all, so I do wish there was a little bit more, but the way that they told the story was really effective. It talks about erasure and colonization and culture, and it's just fantastic. It's a really, really, really interesting story. Because of this one, I'm definitely going to seek out other works by this particular author because I thought it was so innovative and so outside of the box and a really interesting way of telling the story. So that is it for my July wrap-up. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope that you found some new books that maybe you want to read or bump up the TBR, and I would love to hear what you read in the month of July, if there's anything in particular that stands out, if you've read any of these books, or if they are in your TBR. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.